Welcome to another episode of the Hires Podcast.
GPUs in many ways are similar to property, right? They're an expensive, scarce asset that generates yield. And there's a whole bunch of really interesting things that you can do with an asset class like that. This is going to be a really fascinating DeFi landscape that we're only just scratching the surface of. And it's something that Aether is really actively looking to support.
GM, welcome to the Hires Podcast. I'm Jake Lewis, and it's my job to break down projects and interview founders building an Iris ecosystem. In this episode, I had the chance to sit down with Mark Rydon, the co-founder of Aether. I'm sure most of you have heard of Aether. For those that haven't, it's a decentralized compute protocol that has seen over 1 billion total compute hours and upwards of $150 million in annual recurring revenue. During the conversation, we discussed the economic and technical advantages of decentralization, the shift from gaming to AI as the primary driver of compute, and the emergence of GPUs as investable yield-generating assets. Mark also speaks to the challenges of scaling, reliability, and global expansion, as well as Aether's ecosystem, the future of compute, and much, much more. You can learn more about Aether at aether.com. And as always, you can check out Iris at iris.xyz. Enjoy. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, grateful to be here. Thank you, Jake.
Of course, thanks. Excited to have you. So I want to jump in just kind of right off the bat. Given that you're a co-founder and have obviously been with the team since day one, what's the Aether origin story? When did decentralized compute go from kind of an idea to we're going to build this?
Yeah, maybe it's not the most traditional of journeys, but it all started because my co-founder and I are both avid gamers, right? We've been playing PC games since we were kids. I grew up on Counter-Strike and Warcraft 3, Frozen Throne, before I got totally addicted to World of Warcraft while I was at university. But gaming's always been kind of like a big piece of my upbringing. My co-founder, Dan, big gamer as well. He actually took it into his professional life. He was one of the very early hires at Riot Games before taking League of Legends to market as the COO of Riot, and actually oversaw the acquisition of Riot by Tencent, which was one of the reasons why he moved to China, which was where we met. Long story short, my background's in infrastructure, oil and gas in particular, but I've always loved building kind of big things. We had this gaming passion, and one of the big, I think, bugbears within the gaming world as a whole is the fact that there's 3.3 billion gamers out there. 50% of the world are gamers, but the vast majority of the games that I love, and probably the games that you love as well, can't be played by the vast majority of gamers, right? They all have low-end devices, right? They can't afford a high-end, top-of-the-line PC or the latest Xbox or PlayStation, or even, to be fair, a new mobile phone. So as a result, you have this huge content library of incredible games, all the games that Dan and I grew up on that we loved, right? That are inaccessible. And we thought that was a problem worth solving. There was some pretty cool tech coming out of Google at the time, ended up being called Google Stadia. And effectively, it's called cloud gaming. Effectively, it was the ability for you to take a game and instead of asking the user to install that game on their device and then requiring their local device to power and meet the requirements of that game, you actually install the game in the cloud. And then the cloud beams that game down to the user and does all the computational work. All that power happens in the cloud. And effectively, you just have a video stream that's like dynamically streamed to the user, and they just need effectively an internet connection. Long story short, we felt that we could best deliver this technology at scale on the back of decentralized infrastructure for a number of different reasons. The primary one being the fact that the unit economics of distributing GPUs in this matter made a lot more sense in a distributed or decentralized system as opposed to a centralized one. If you look at how Google Stadia has progressed today, right? It was an emergent technology when we adopted it, but Google Stadia today was shut down because even on the back of their own infrastructure, even on the back of Google's own infrastructure, they couldn't scale this technology to the places that people needed it. It's just too expensive. And if it's too expensive for Google, then it's probably going to be too expensive for a startup like us at the time to do as well. So we figured if we can just build this on the back of other people's infrastructure, that solves a whole bunch of problems. And thankfully, there were a couple of interesting projects emerging in the crypto space at the time. many of which you'd be obviously familiar with, Helium, Filecoin, even the idea of Bitcoin, right? How Bitcoin's hash power was effectively just a collection of home PCs, right? At the time, obviously it's an institutional grade ecosystem now, but for a long time, Bitcoin was just something that people did on their old computers. And this idea of co-opting hardware to solve a really big problem was something that we thought we could kind of use to build out a GPU cloud.
Yeah, it's fascinating. First off, it's funny that you bring up the gaming background. It seems like there's a crazy correlation between successful founders and having, the CSGO, World of Warcraft, or League of Legends experience. You guys have all three, so that's awesome. And then economic side, related to DeepIn, that's also really interesting. Definitely want to do a deep dive on that a bit later. But first, let's kind of also start at the top. I'm sure most of our listeners know what Aether is, and you kind of defined it there. But for those that don't, do you mind giving, a high-level overview? What does Aether serve, and what problems do you solve?
So Aether is effectively a distributed GPU cloud. You could think of us like an AWS or a Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure. The big difference here is we only focus on enterprise-grade GPUs, and we don't own any of the GPUs in our cloud, right? So in that sense, we're much more an Airbnb or an Uber. We're a company built on the back of a fleet of infrastructure that's not necessarily owned and operated by ourselves. Why is that necessary? If you go to an AWS, for example, or Google Cloud, they have a whole collection of servers and bits and bobs within their cloud, right? They're not specialists. And as a result, they have incredibly expensive services, and they aren't really out there to give you the best deal. They know that their stack is sticky, and they know that you'd probably prefer to work with them than a NeoCloud competitor. Anyway, as a result, there's been a very fast-moving emergent sector of high-performance compute clouds, of which Aether is one. Again, big difference is that we don't own any of that compute, which means we can scale incredibly quickly and into regions where it would take a long time for these other big incumbents to kind of meet. It's a cloud that primarily serves AI customers. We obviously have our roots in gaming. We still do a whole bunch of stuff on the cloud gaming side, but we now have a big stack of GPU cloud that provides services for both training, so taking ChatGPT 3 to ChatGPT 4, that sort of workload, and then also the inferencing, which is the act of the AI actually doing the job it's been trained for. So every time you chat to ChatGPT, for example, every interaction you have is effectively a factor of a small amount of time on a GPU doing that inference work.
Yeah, the positioning is fascinating. And inherent in what you're saying is this common framing of being GPU rich versus GPU poor. Why do you think compute is so concentrated today? And is there like a risk there as we move closer towards AGI?
Yeah, 100%. This is the centralized AI versus decentralized AI challenge, right? The issue at the moment is that AI, particularly highly performant AI, benefits so much from centralization, right? Centralization of resources, for example. These AI companies that we know and hear about and probably interact with every day now are raising capital rounds, venture capital rounds that exceed anything that's ever been done before. You've got OpenAI raising, I think it was like $7 or $8 billion in their last round. And Sam Altman made a joke, but he suggested that he needs something like $11 trillion to achieve what he wants to achieve. It was like a significant portion of the global GDP. There's never been a more capital intense sector than what we're seeing now. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, the AI race, the race to AGI, is arguably the most important race ever run, right? The winner of that race effectively wins everything, right? There is no second place. There's just one winner forever. And that's a pretty wild thing to consider, right? So then any means necessary effectively becomes the status quo to win that race. And the way it looks at the moment, at least as far as what we call scaling laws seem to be demonstrating, is that we have this somewhat linear trajectory for intelligence, where if you add X amount of data and X amount of GPUs, you progress on a line towards the top right. And somewhere over there is AGI. And if you just keep pumping GPUs into it, and you keep pumping data, right, you'll progress up that line. And the goal is to progress up that line faster than the next guy. So it has become a capital race, right? One where NVIDIA is probably the ultimate beneficiary at the moment, but all of these model companies like Anthropic and OpenAI, and then also what we're seeing with Google and others and Meta, they just know that every dollar they put into buying those GPUs and obviously finding data to feed those GPUs is money spent towards winning the ultimate race. So it's highly incentivized that they centralize as much capital in one place as possible so they can buy as many GPUs as possible and hire the best people. What I think we all saw Zuckerberg offering, what was it, $100 million salary? It's like $1 billion for AI researchers to join his Meta AI team. Pretty insane.
So the counter argument, I guess, that I'm looking to kind of tease out here is what makes a DeepIn approach compelling. Like, obviously you have these hyperscalers that want to centralize everything, but what's the rationale around kind of taking the DeepIn approach? I know you mentioned that, there are different areas that you can scale in much quicker than maybe centralized alternatives, but, is there anything else that the decentralization side unlocks that centralized clouds can't?
Sure. I think one thing to consider when you take a look at the AI landscape is whether we do just only want 4 or 5 companies building cool stuff in AI, right? I think access to resources is something that we want to encourage. Ideally, we're lowering the barrier to entry to high performance compute over time, making it more affordable, more accessible. And that's something that's going to result in a little bit of diversity in what's being produced. And I think in general, that's a good thing, particularly when we take into account some of these issues like privacy, access to data, sovereignty, also bias that exists in models and how we encourage or train models to respond to certain issues. I think it's good to have a diversity of opinion when things like that are being produced. So I think that's just a core facet. Aether is a really interesting kind of way of functioning. Effectively, Aether almost represents, in many ways, the inefficiency of utilization of compute worldwide, right? We don't own any compute. Anyone that has underutilized compute or is struggling to find a place for that compute to find viable work can effectively just deposit their compute in our network, and then we'll do that for them, right? We regularly surface and redistribute effectively this kind of net new supply that wouldn't be on the market otherwise. And we do it in ways that is both cost effective, meaning startups and small to medium-sized enterprise, like everyone can get access to that compute. But we're also very cognizant of the type of terms that we offer around the contracts for that compute. You go to these big hyperscalers, they'll make you, forecast your compute contract for a year in advance, 2 years in advance. Otherwise, no, we won't give you that GPU. We'll give it to someone else who will. We're very much about offering that flexibility. So again, a startup who doesn't know where they'll be 6 months from now, let alone 24, can come in and get compute on a month-by-month contract or a 3-month contract. And I think that's obviously very, very critical. You mentioned distribution, and I think distribution is really important, but maybe even more important than I think it sounds on the surface. A quick example, CoreWeave just IPO'd a couple of months ago. They were the biggest IPO since, I think, 2021. Raised about $1.5 billion, launched it around a $23 billion valuation. If you'd invested at IPO, they're up to about $43 billion now. So pretty good investment. All they do is buy GPUs. So they buy their GPUs and then they deploy them in data centers. And then they do deals with OpenAI and other big players. They spent $8 billion buying GPUs, right? Almost every single GPU, over 90% of the GPUs are in the US. Only recently did they open up space in some data centers in London. AI is not just being built in the US, right? AI is being built all over the world. But as a result, again, of the way that capital is centralized and the way that these companies are functioning, we're getting this geographic centralization of resources as well that is, again, putting blockers in place for other countries to get access to these kind of really important resources to help develop things like sovereign AI that captures identity of local regions in really important ways. So there's a really interesting distribution case there as well.
Yeah. Summing that up, it sounds like it's really a game of, one, lowering friction, two, increasing capital efficiency, and then three, curating a more healthy geographic distribution, all of which obviously are very important. And on the other side of the coin, in any distributed environment, there's typically a negative argument around how decentralization might create latency. And to be fair, latency does matter. More latency creates more friction for the end user, especially around gaming and real-time AI. Now, I've also come across this framing of compute near the user, which aligns with exactly what you were just saying. I was referenced a few times through my research. So do you mind elaborating on this concept specifically, speaking to how it actually would reduce lag in practice?
Sure. So this is a funny little gap that I have to bridge often. And that is this idea that decentralized compute, particularly from an AI context, means that if I want access to a server or multiple servers, more particularly, that all of those servers will be in different locations. And as a result of that, there'll be some form of lag or latency or issue that I have on the performance side. That's not actually the case. We have obviously huge numbers of massive co-located clusters that have contributed compute to Aether. We have multiple models running on multiple thousand H100 clusters within Aether's ecosystem. So we have obviously decentralization from an ownership perspective, highly distributed. We're in over 200 locations across 90 different countries. But within that distribution, we also have big GPU owners that have thousands and thousands of GPUs in singular locations that have contributed those co-located clusters to Aether's network. And that's what allows us to really do business with these big enterprise customers, which is very much our focus. So I guess, first of all, just to clarify that from a decentralization perspective, Aether's decentralized. We don't own any of the GPUs. However, that doesn't mean we don't have access to obviously massive amounts of co-located clusters to allow you to run the big training or inferencing runs that you need to do as a big enterprise customer. The question on latency, however, is very relevant from a gaming perspective. And this was actually the core reason why we chose to build our cloud gaming infrastructure on the back of decentralized compute. Now, if you think about the way that a traditional cloud scales, say Google Cloud, for example, let's say they want to open up a data center and expand into, I don't know, Tokyo, right? Let's say they don't have GPUs there. First thing they have to do is buy a huge number of GPUs, upfront, capital intensive. They then have to take those GPUs, deploy them into a data center. Hopefully there's a data center with enough space. Let's assume there is. They put all those GPUs in that data center. The most cost-effective way for them to manage those resources is to have them all in one place. Do a big commercial deal, right? Not have them distributed out all over, have multiple teams, multiple people helicoptering between multiple locations. It's just not efficient management of that resource for a big company. When you look at how high-performance GPUs are distributed in these systems, they clump, right? They're big blobs of GPUs in kind of singular locations. And if you think about how a user gains access to those GPUs, latency is largely a factor of how far away a user is from where the compute's located. So you can think of these compute blobs as being the center of a dartboard. And then as the user gets further and further away, their performance drops. Now, in distributed networks, the GPUs are owned by different parties, right? So there's no economic incentive for those GPUs to clump together. They don't gain any advantage from being adjacent to each other. So you just naturally end up having a more scattered distribution of compute across whichever region you're looking to target. And as a result of that, you generally are able to have a closer adjacency between a node in your network and a user. So as your network scales, as more GPUs onboard into your network, you're constantly reducing the distance between a user and a node. So it's one of these really fantastic kind of flywheels where as your network scales, you get more performant over time, but also you actually get more cost effective over time because the cost of delivery of service to someone who's more adjacent to the node is also lower. So you have this really interesting flywheel of performance, of scale, improving performance and reducing cost, which is quite unique.
Yeah, it's almost like a different framing around distribution being a moat, a distribution in a different sense, but it obviously does create a moat as that compounding effect starts to take place. And another big theme there that you touched on is capital efficiency. I've seen claims of anywhere from 40 to 90% savings versus hyperscalers. This is also, I believe, with no egress fees. So where do these savings come from? How do the economics actually work there?
It's a factor of two things. It's a factor of the unit economic benefits of a decentralized network, right? Of not owning the compute ourselves. Think of it this way. If you have an asset, if you're a CFO of a tech company and you've got an asset, and this is a very expensive asset. Like this compute infrastructure is the most expensive compute infrastructure that's ever existed, right? The most expensive server infrastructure that's ever existed. It's burning a hole in tech companies' pockets, right? If that compute is not being utilized, it's a liability, right? So anything that you can do to find a way to offset that liability, if you're overextended or if you're underutilizing that infrastructure, if you had a delay in production, whatever the reason is, anything you could do to offset that liability is beneficial, right? You don't care necessarily if you're getting the absolute tip-top best price out there in the market that someone like AWS can maybe get, right? You just care about not having that liability. The mentality of this space that we're operating in is very different to a hyperscaler itself. And that is the second reason that there's such a price differential, in that hyperscalers aren't really out there to give you a great price. You'll still see pricing on AWS and Google Cloud where they're pricing an H100 at $6 to $8 an hour, right? Market rate is $2, and everyone knows it. They'll still price it at $6 to $8 to $10 net. It's out of whack, but people will still pay. So we could very comfortably say we had an even bigger discount on offer than we actually do. But to be honest, we tend to price ourselves more against a kind of a market rate as opposed to an outrageous sticker price that we see with someone like a hyperscaler.
That's healthy. There's also a concept around reliability at scale that I found interesting. Numbers quoted as high as over 95% utilization and quality of service checks. How do you keep these standards so high in a distributed network?
Yeah, that's a big one for us, right? And it actually stems largely from our roots, right? We started in this gaming world. We had to deliver a service to gaming companies that were then putting their game on our service and distributing that to gamers. And no one complains more than a gamer if there's lag, if there is a service outage or something like that. And what we realized very early on was that if we wanted this to work, we needed to build from day one an enterprise grade service with SLA capability on par with any of the other players in the space. There was no discount that we were able to give that would overcome the risk of a gaming company having a poor quality of service through a distribution channel. And that meant that we had a really interesting kind of series of problems to solve. Because at the time, the way that DPINs scaled, and they weren't called DPINs back then, but the way that DPINs scaled, like Filecoin, for example, was largely on the back of consumer equipment, right? On the back of idle hard disk space on a PC, or with render network on the back of idle GPU resources. We realized that if we wanted to beat these SLAs, we couldn't scale our network in the same way. We had to do it in a way that allows it to constantly meet those performance and quality and uptime criteria. So it meant that we only could aggregate enterprise grade equipment. So that was the first step. All right, we're not going to touch consumer equipment. It's too difficult for us to manage in a way that allows us to meet those criteria. So we're only going to deal with enterprise grade equipment, right? And then on top of that, we're going to have to make some decentralization trade-offs. This idea of permissionless compute onboarding, this idea of having this just super, super accessible cloud was something that we probably couldn't deliver, right? We had to take a little bit more of a Web 2 approach with paper contracts, SLAs, right? Really a process of quality control and supply management that's more in line with what you see at a hyperscaler, right? We copied the playbook there, but that obviously means we made a few trades away from decentralization. So I like to think that we have taken advantage of some of the best that the technology of kind of the blockchain space has to offer, but whilst also leaning on what makes enterprise grade tech companies stable and gives them the longevity that they need to scale to the size that they are today.
Sure. I think it's a smart Pareto solve, really, all things considered. And really all these metrics we talked about up to this point are compelling. But actually what I find most impressive is the fact that the protocol has now crossed over 1 billion compute hours. That's an insane number. And you've referenced in a couple different ways where this demand is coming from, AI training and inference or cloud gaming. But I'm curious to know a little bit more about what this split looks like maybe specifically, like who are some of the top users or maybe even user archetypes if you aren't comfortable directly referencing users. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I think in the beginning, of course, gaming was a very big piece of the revenue they were bringing in. But over time, as we started to flesh out the offerings we had for AI companies, the inbound was pretty insane. Obviously, as a young company that was talking about all of these GPUs we had in our cloud, we started to get hit up by all these AI companies. This is pre-ChatGPT. And we're like, what's this kind of AI thing about? And we started to investigate and deploy more and more. And slowly, maybe not so slowly, to be honest, the demand from the AI side just overtook that of gaming. I would say now it's probably about 70-30 AI to gaming. And then within that 70%, it's probably about, I would say at the moment, 60-40 training to inferencing. And that's largely because, at least at the moment anyway, the big contracts tend to be the training contracts. Any team that's doing any form of kind of training is usually a special type of team. There's not that many of them. They've accrued capital in a way that allows them to have the team capable of training some form of model. They know when they start that journey that it's going to be capital intensive, right? They've priced in the fact that they're going to need to raise a lot of money to pay for a lot of compute if they want to walk that path. And as a result, those contracts are usually a lot bigger. They want to book in compute for at least a year, most commonly 2 years at a time. And these are generally 8+ figure contracts. However, the velocity of contracts is much higher on the inferencing side, as you can imagine, right? Over the last 6 months in particular, we've had this kind of agent boom. I think we're all seeing all of these kind of incredible tools and companies that are popping up across the broader sort of tech ecosystem, just not in Web3, like in Web2 itself. And that's just super, super exciting. So we're seeing a huge number of agent companies, huge number of kind of enterprise tools that are selling into the B2B space. One very cool partnership that I'm happy to be able to more publicly announce is Everlyn, which is a video AI model. They just have got a great shout out from Jan LeCun, the chief AI scientist at Meta. He used to work with the founders of Everlyn. He shouted them out recently. That was pretty cool. But yeah, we invested in them early on and we've been working with them for quite a while now, supporting the growth of their model on our cloud. And that's just a great example of one of the companies that uses our infrastructure.
So do you see the inferencing side growing faster than the training side over the next couple of years? Do you think inference is going to overtake the training component at some point? Or do you think they're growing relatively equally? Or how do you see that kind of playing out over the next couple of years?
I think the expectation is that the inferencing curve does overtake the training curve. I think it makes a lot of sense. You have these kind of large frontier models pushing out releases. Every release they have, they spin off a whole product line of companies that are building on top of their infrastructure. I think more and more companies are going to be required to build on this type of infrastructure. You can go pretty deep predicting the impact that's going to have on the broader tech ecosystem. I've heard it phrased as the death of the IPO, right? Like, how do you have tech companies going on a 5 to 8 year journey to IPO when the next time ChatGPT releases the model, you could have an agent that could copy your tech stack in 20 minutes? I don't know. I think inferencing, as a result of just the power of AI and the number of builders that are going to be using those tools and the role that AI will play in pretty much every facet of our lives, means that, yeah, the inferencing curve will eventually overtake for sure. But I will say the big contracts are probably going to remain, at least for us, on the training side for the next maybe 12 months. But I think very soon that eclipse will happen within Aether's ecosystem for sure.
Yeah. It'll be an exciting time, no doubt, especially kind of for the broader space. So yeah, speaking of partnerships, I find it really fascinating what you and the Aether team has been able to do. A few recent partnerships and initiatives have hinted at GPUFi. Is it on the roadmap for Aether to make compute become an investable, yield-bearing asset, or is there anything kind of in that space that you guys are looking to do?
100%. And this is actually one of the things I'm most interested in that Aether's working on. At a high level, GPUs in many ways are similar to property, right? They're an expensive, scarce asset that generates yield. And there's a whole bunch of really interesting things that you can do with an asset class like that. We've seen the way that RWAs have come in and revolutionized the property market. We see a very similar thing happening with GPUs, whether it's tokenized access to purchasing the asset class itself, or whether it's structured financial products around the yields that those asset classes generate. I think that this is going to be a really fascinating DeFi landscape that we're only just scratching the surface of. And it's something that Aether is really actively looking to support, right? So to be honest, if anyone's listening to this and they think that's a really interesting problem that they'd like to address, or if you're already working on it, feel free to hit us up. We'd love to support you with a grant, get you on our GPUs, figure out a way to get whatever you're building up and running. We do have an internal product that we will be going live with in the next maybe month or two that is relevant to this whole sector. And that is what we call third-party staking. When a compute provider onboards into Aether, they need to pay a deposit. They need to stake, right? You're incredibly familiar with this requirement, I'm sure, through Iris. But for those that maybe don't understand why this is necessary, when you stay at a hotel, right, you're very used to, you pay the room rate, you check in, and during that check-in process, they'll ask you to pay a deposit, right? And that's because they need a way to guarantee that they can get something back if you decide to have a raging party and kick the TV, or if take some whiskey from the minibar, right? They want to know that they've got something that they can hold on to if you misbehave. And if you don't misbehave, you get that deposit back really easily. The same goes for contributing infrastructure into DePINs. 9 times out of 10, they'll ask you for a deposit. And that's because the network is connecting that infrastructure to a customer. And we need that infrastructure to behave so that the customer has a good experience. So we get more customers, we can find more business for more infrastructure. Now, it makes total sense. However, I think arguably for maybe the first time in the history of a DePIN, we're getting to the point now where the scale of ownership of GPUs is such that if you want to pull a data center of GPUs into the network, which is what you need in many cases, you have 8-9 figures worth of GPUs. And the deposit, just like if you stay in the presidential suite of a hotel compared to a single bedroom in the basement, the deposit is different, right? So if you're pulling in $100 million worth of GPUs, the amount that you're required to stake into the network could arguably be very high, right? If you don't generally have $1 million, $5 million, $10 million just sitting on the sidelines as an owner of GPUs, why wouldn't you just use that to buy more GPUs? So that was something that we realized and we're predicting as a bottleneck as we continue down this path of scaling, right? We've got 400,000 GPUs in the network now, multiple large co-located clusters, like I mentioned. But if we want more, if we want the really big guys so we can start getting people like OpenAI on our books, we need to be able to solve that bottleneck. And that's where third-party staking comes in, right? It's the idea of, okay, instead of making them pay a deposit, how about we loan them the deposit? We get everyone in our network to contribute to a pool. That pool can be used to loan the deposit to that data center, and they pay you a yield, right? They pay you a portion of the money, the revenue that they earn from that asset, and they pay it into the pool. And if they behave, when they depart the ecosystem, you get back your initial stake and the yield on top. very cool solution to a really cool problem, and exciting as well because it's real yield. It's real business. It's real money. It's real revenue. It's not like token shenanigans. Like this is just a real business that is generating a huge amount of money, and they're willing to pay a little bit of that in yield to help them overcome that deposit hurdle.
It's a really smart architectural decision, almost like a market within a market. The first thing that comes to mind with that to me is around slashing risk or the equivalent. So is this kind of collateralized to avoid that from happening, or what's the risk associated with participating in this kind of sub-market?
Yeah, that's obviously a big consideration and one that I think we've overcome in a number of interesting ways. To be honest, if you are contributing to the third-party staking solution, that's not something you need to worry about. This is purely about de-risked access to yield. And I think that's really important for people.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned a little bit earlier, about grants. And I understand that you guys launched around $100 million ecosystem fund. So there you're offering grants and, up to like 35% or so for compute subsidies. In this light, who are you looking to attract? Who should apply here? What makes a perfect application from your perspective?
At a high level, we'd love to attract anyone building in the AI space, whether you're a big company with already established compute demand, we can tap you into that 30 to 35% subsidy very easily to make the move onto our infrastructure as de-risked as possible. But in my mind, the ecosystem fund, this $100 million fund we set up, is very much about getting resources to the early stage builders as quickly as possible. When we started the ecosystem fund, I made a kind of a very public announcement that we'd be willing to go from introduction to deployment within, I can't remember whether I said 24 hours or 48 hours, right? But it was a very small window. And that was right at the peak of the agent boom about 4 or 5 months ago, whatever it was. And that was because things seemed like they were happening overnight, right? At the very least, it felt like the market had shifted week on week. And this idea that you had a young company looking to get an agent or a new AI application out there on the market, and they'd have to wait for 6 weeks for an IC to meet, do 5DD calls, was just crazy. I was like, how are companies meant to get their product out there and actually start building? So we said, let's get this ecosystem fund out there. Let's create a process where we're able to take it from like introduction to deployment as functionally quick as possible and get people building. And people were like, why would you do that? That doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. But in our mind, it was incredibly logical, right? Because these companies, if they hit, right, if they do well, the only way they scale is on the back of GPU infrastructure, right? Every customer that they onboard is more compute requirements that they have. So for us, we see it as a small amount of upfront capital to capture the ongoing business of a company that needs GPUs to grow. They cannot scale without access to those GPUs. And we're lucky enough to have a very big community, a kind of fantastic marketing machine within Aether now. We're a massive company. We've got a lot of access to these marketing and community-based resources. And we help companies do that too. So the ecosystem fund was in many ways also a little bit of a podium for these companies to really share to the world this label of legitimacy that they gained from accessing a grant or an investment from Aether. And that's why we did them in these weekly batches. We made a big thing out of the announcements because we wanted everyone to see these companies and understand that this was a badge of approval, because the more successful they got, the better it was for Aether.
I mean, properly aligned incentives across the board. It's a very clean solve a significant issue. And I understand within this component, you're running joint programs with, XAI, XPLA, you're supporting Avalanche, Infra, Biddle. So yeah, very impressive kind of across the board. Is there any nuance to how you're working with these different teams as opposed to kind of controlling the program internally?
I think, to be honest, for us, and this is not to cast any shade on the way that others operate, but for us, we're very open with sharing access to our community, sharing access to what we've built and the credibility we've generated. This idea that every post on your timeline needs to be protected as a big company, I think is really disappointing, right? Particularly if you're building an ecosystem where you need companies to participate and want to be a part of what you're building. So for us, we're incredibly open with how we share access to not just our community, but how we are willing to promote and support the parties that join our community. I think the only nuance that we really have when we go out and make these big partnerships is that we want to be on good terms with the projects that come through and partner with us. We want to do things with them, get them at our events. Aether's a boring company at its core. We're infrastructure, right? We do data centers and GPUs. The interest for us is largely in the cool products that people build on top of us. So we want a great relationship with those companies so we can say, hey, look at this cool thing that was built on top of Aether's infrastructure. Like I mentioned, Everland is a great example.
Absolutely. And bringing this full circle, we're of course also working together. I wanted to get your perspective on what went into the decision to store compute data on Iris, and also maybe how you see the relationship evolving over time.
100%. I think data is as important to the AI ecosystem as compute, right? There's really three pieces to the triangle. You've got the models, they come from companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, etc. And then you've got compute down here and data over here. You can't really have AI without those three pieces. So we've always been looking for strong data partnerships. I think what Iris is building is just really incredible. This kind of hot data access, dynamic data access that you have within your network was something that we didn't really have a good solution for. And it was just really, I think, good timing and also a great product that kind of encouraged us to get in bed and push for, I think, such a kind of exciting collaboration. To be honest, we're big believers in what you guys are building. We want to be, again, attached to that success. I think you guys are also supported by our VCs. We've got a lot of kind of great shared networks. And to be honest, I think you guys are going to do really cool things. So hopefully you remember us when you blow up.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that, Mark. Yeah, it's obviously a really exciting partnership. And, when you break it down to fundamental building blocks for AI, you said it, perfectly. It's data storage and compute. And so being able to provide those services together and collaborate on that over time is obviously going to be very healthy across the board. And shifting gears, you mentioned this earlier. I wanted to kind of come back and touch on it before we start to wrap up. Aether already is live across 90 plus companies. I guess I'll maybe 94 or more than that when I was doing some research. How do you look at where you strategically expand into next? What does that process look like? How do you handle, local compliance and support without having some type of central data center model?
That's one of the great advantages of the DePIN model, right? We don't need a legal entity in Turkey, right, to onboard Turkish GPUs into our network, right? We don't need the ability to make payments to a Turkish data center and worry about Forex or foreign exchange risk or our funds being seized because we're transferring them to some weird bank. And the flip side of that is the data center in Turkey and the GPU owner in Turkey don't need to worry about the fact that they may or may not get paid from this kind of entity that's all the way on the other side of the world, right? Everything's programmed into the smart contract. It's trustless. It's this idea that if I plug in, if I connect, I have guaranteed reward. My work is going to be recognized. My hardware is going to be recognized. And this ability to forecast and formulate your rewards or your kind of revenue as a result of participating in networks is super clear. So it takes away a vast amount of the complexity of onboarding infrastructure in different regions all over the world. So I think that's just a natural advantage that decentralized networks like ours have. How do we more broadly look at expansion within Aether? I like to say that we're a supply-led business, right? So we're always looking to increase the supply, contributing to GPU cloud, right? But we like to keep demand in touch with supply. To be honest, we could open the floodgates tomorrow and probably double or triple the amount of compute in our network. We have a huge amount of compute supply sitting, waiting to come into the network. But, and this is the risk that I was alluding to previously with regards to totally permissionless ecosystems, if you don't have that gate, bad actors come in, right? They contribute their compute because they know that there's going to be a protocol-based reward for that contribution. And as soon as that protocol-based reward is gone, they leave. And also, depending on how supply is structured in these networks, you have mechanisms that kind of do or do not work. And keeping supply managed, right, and also keeping demand in touch with that supply in the ratio that makes sense for your business, I think is really critical as you grow. So for us, we're growing very quickly, but we're also growing strategically. And that is a factor of managed supply and a huge amount of demand within the network that's allowed us to just hit these exciting targets. And I think I mentioned it before, we're sitting at around almost 150 mil in annual recurring revenue through the ecosystem now. That's about 145. And that's just a pretty insane number for a DeepIn project.
It's serious revenue. And it makes a lot of sense given all the thought that's gone into every single design decision, every single strategic decision that you've made up to this point. So it doesn't surprise me, but at the same time, it's obviously a massive, massive number. And speaking of growth, one of my last questions before we wrap up here, say we were to run into each other 2 years from now, late 2027, what do you think success looks like for the Aether protocol?
Tough question. The whole space is moving so quickly, right? The broader AI ecosystem, it's pretty insane. I think $1 billion in annual recurring revenue. And I don't even think that's a stretch goal. I think that's just a natural figure that we'll hit within the next 2 years based on just the rate that we're growing, the rate that I see demand continuing in the marketplace. So many macro factors just pushing that number on us. If you think about the global power grid at the moment, the rate of power demand from data centers is increasing faster than the rate we can onboard new power into the grid across every economy that's onboarding GPUs, right? Over 50% of the US's growth in power demand is coming from data centers now. So you've got all of these factors that are pushing for a supply constraint. And the more constrained the market is, and we're going to continue to see demand for compute as a result of kind of the growth of the AI sector as a whole, the more that supply is constrained, the more important it'll be to manage that compute efficiently. And that's exactly where Aether comes in and fills in all the cracks. We're very much like Airbnb in a city with one hotel. Everyone's just going to be putting their spare rooms onto Airbnb because the opportunity cost of not doing it is just growing over time. And I don't see that changing for the next significant period of time.
No doubt there's exciting times ahead. And I could continue to talk to you for another hour. I find all this stuff incredibly interesting, but I know we're getting up on time, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Mark, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we shut down the recording?
No, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you for listening. If you do find anything that we're saying interesting, definitely check out Aether's socials. There's a lot that we're doing. We have a great community. We'd love to introduce you to all of the projects within our ecosystem. I think we're building one of the coolest things in the space, just like Iris. So feel free to check us out and stay in touch.
Incredible. Well, Mark, thanks again for coming onto the show. Really, really enjoyed it and excited to see the continued growth of Aether.
Yeah, likewise. Excited to see the growth of Iris. Pumped for what you guys are delivering, and thanks for having me.